The rain came sideways on Peckham's Rye Lane, needling the glass of Naomi Clark's beauty shop until the faded decals looked like they were dissolving. Inside, the fluorescent tube shivered to life in uneven pulses, throwing a pale strobe across a second-hand chair with a squeaky hydraulic pedal and a sterilizer that took 10 minutes too long to reach temperature. She had 2 walk-ins all day, an elderly nurse with wind-chapped cheeks who paid in coins and a teenage boy with razor bumps who left embarrassed but grateful, and a courier who asked her to sign for a parcel meant for the vape shop next door. The till held less than the stack of bills paperclipped beneath it, and a thin letter from the landlord, reviewing rent in the spring, sat under a chipped mug like a threat. Naomi didn't dramatize, she documented. She logged patch test outcomes in a ruled notebook, reset the timer on the sterilizer, wiped every metal surface twice, and held her breath as the lights flickered again. Outside, buses sighed and moved on. Inside, her shop, 3 mirrors, 1 steamer, a cracked basin, smelled faintly of eucalyptus and determination. When she turned the sign to closed, it felt less like surrender and more like a pact with herself. We go again tomorrow. She tugged on a windbreaker and ran. Past the shuttered grocer, past the puddled zebra crossing, past the fried chicken place where steam ghosted the windows, Naomi cut toward the river like she always did when numbers shouted. Along the Thames, the city's edges sharpened, the shard a glass metronome, Blackfriars Bridge humming with late trains, the wet smell of stone older than any bill. She counted in 4s, inhale, hold, exhale, hold, until her pulse steadied, and the noise in her head thinned to a question she could live with: what would make care both safer and simpler? Back home, 1 room above a laundrette, kettle that clicked off early, she opened a laptop, not for gossip but for case studies. She read about supplier minimums, net 30 traps, packaging failures, and how ingredient transparency could be an advantage, not a liability. She diagrammed on scrap paper, skin assessment evidence-backed routine honest pricing. No artistry claims, no miracle cures, only method and respect. In a browser tab, she bookmarked a notice for a public talk by a dermatologist named Dr. Oliver Reed the following week. In a text file, she wrote a single sentence and underlined it twice: safety isn't a luxury, make it reachable. It was nearly midnight when she reached the bus stop, rain needling the tin roof, timetable smeared. A woman in a navy trench coat ducked under the shelter, balancing an overstuffed tote and a paper cup that steamed up her glasses. "They've changed the route again," the woman said, breathless and amused, like late nights were a sport she kept winning. Naomi smiled, wiped a wet strand from her cheek, and shifted her kit bag to make room. The woman noticed the sterilizer manual peeking from the zipper. "You're in care?" she asked. "Sort of," Naomi said, and explained the shop, tiny, meticulous, 2 customers today, and the notebook where she recorded everything that didn't quite add up yet. "Priya," the woman said, offering a card with the concise weight of a barrister's chambers stamped at the bottom. "If a contract ever snarls at you, call. I collect snarls." Their bus didn't come, another did. They took it anyway, sitting an aisle apart, 2 strangers who recognized the same habit: keep moving. When Naomi stepped off 3 stops early to pick up distilled water from the 24-hour chemist, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She didn't open it on the pavement, in the rain. She slipped the bottle into her bag, pressed the landlord's letter flatter, and told herself, aloud, because sometimes you have to hear it, tomorrow, 3 customers. And one day, a system that makes it easier for them all. Naomi Clark's roots stretched back to a modest seaside town where the salt wind stung cheeks red and houses leaned into the gusts like old sailors. Her parents, Robert and Elaine, were not wealthy people, but they were patient, principled, and lived with a quiet dignity that imprinted on Naomi more than she realized. Elaine worked as a school librarian, carrying the scent of dust and ink wherever she went, while Robert was a mechanic who believed in fixing things properly, not quickly. Naomi's childhood days weren't gilded with luxuries, but they were framed by trust and responsibility: borrowed bicycles that had to be returned shining, borrowed books that had to be returned with spines uncreased. When neighbors asked who would help thread hair for school plays or tidy up costumes for choir recitals, it was Naomi who raised her hand, not out of artistic passion, but out of a belief that details, small, neat, Unnoticed were the difference between someone feeling invisible or feeling seen. Those early acts planted in her a discipline that no storm could wash out. By the time she entered university, Naomi had learned to budget not just money but time like currency. Her mornings began with lectures in business administration, afternoons disappeared into shifts at a high-street retail chain where she folded denim until her fingers blistered, and evenings were consumed by a spiral-bound notebook where she cataloged what customers complained about most: bad returns policies, mislabeled ingredients, products that promised miracles but delivered rashes. She wasn't chasing glamour, she was chasing precision. In between, she ran 5 kilometers by the river, 10 when exams threatened to crush her, half marathons when grief or anxiety bit too deep. Running wasn't an escape, it was a recalibration. And in the quiet of those late-night dorm rooms, while others went clubbing or courted hangovers, Naomi downloaded French-language podcasts and repeated sentences allowed to keep her brain elastic. She didn't dream of Paris cafes or Rome boutiques, she dreamt of writing labels in multiple languages so no customer would ever feel tricked by small print again. It was during one of those charity runs in Hyde Park that fate, if it could be called that, brought Adrienne Mercer into her orbit. She had been struggling with a cramp, bent double near a water station, when a hand offered her an electrolyte packet without hesitation. Adrienne, lean, flushed, grinning through his own exhaustion, was not just running for himself but pacing 2 novices behind him, shouting encouragements that sounded more like commands. They crossed the line minutes apart, strangers linked by sweat and resolve. Afterward, sitting on the grass with medals hanging like tin toys, they swapped stories, hers about inventories and endless returns, his about venues and sound checks that went catastrophically wrong but somehow ended in applause. They traded phone numbers not with fireworks but with a shrug, yet that evening 1 text became 3, 3 became 10, and within weeks coffee breaks bled into late-night strategy debates. For Naomi, it wasn't romance first, it was recognition. She had found someone else whose pulse quickened not at leisure, but at the brink of possibility. Adrienne Mercer's teenage years were shaped less by comfort and more by improvisation. Raised in the shadows of East London council estates, he learned early that opportunity rarely knocked, it had to be engineered. His mother, Vivian, worked as a hotel concierge, immaculate in posture and speech, expecting the same precision from her son. She taught him how to fold napkins properly, how to greet guests with the right balance of warmth and detachment, and how reputation could be built on gestures most people overlooked. But Adrienne's restlessness clashed with her meticulousness. At 16, he preferred odd jobs where chaos ruled, loading equipment into vans, holding ladders during makeshift light rigs, or sweeping confetti off concrete after events. He loved the hum of preparation, the smell of metal scaffolding, and the adrenaline of tight schedules. By 18, Adrienne was juggling school with back-to-back temp jobs, sometimes working until dawn before sitting an exam. It was punishing, yet each sleepless night stitched into him a belief: if the spotlight won't land on you, then at least own the switch that controls it. His early career was a cocktail of scrappy brilliance and near disasters. In Shoreditch, he ran a warehouse event on a shoestring budget, stringing fairy lights through pipes that creaked under weight, and hiring a DJ who showed up drunk and spinning the wrong vinyls. The fire marshal threatened to shut it all down, but Adrienne scrambled, soberly negotiating until only a stern warning was issued. That night, despite the mess, the crowd roared, and he felt an electric certainty that failure and triumph were only seconds apart. From there, he built a reputation for making the impossible barely possible, staging a food festival in a car park without proper permits, turning a leaking basement into a pop-up jazz lounge, and handling the inevitable chaos with a grin that concealed his own nerves. Every Sunday, he punished his body with triathlon training, as though endurance sports could prepare him for the next logistical disaster. If Naomi thrived on control and detail, Adrienne thrived on the knife edge, where one slip could unravel everything. It was during one of those chaotic successes, a Riverside art showcase nearly rained out, that Adrienne first voiced a promise he didn't fully understand the weight of. Sitting on crates with Naomi afterward, shoes soaked, equipment half broken, and invoices still unpaid, he looked at her with fire in his eyes and said, "One day, I'll stage a show the entire city will stop to watch." Naomi, exhausted but smiling faintly, tucked that promise away, uncertain if it was dream or delusion. For Adrian, though, it became a mantra whispered on long bike rides and scribbled into notebooks between gig schedules. Yet, hidden inside that vow was his blind spot. He rarely noticed the invisible scaffolding of effort others provided, the steady hands, the unseen hours that allowed his risks to pay off. His climb upward was real, relentless, and magnetic, but it leaned too often on those who loved him, a truth that would later echo when loyalty was tested and cracks appeared in places he didn't think to look. Sienna Rowe had not grown up with the steady ground Naomi once knew, nor the improvised grit Adrian thrived on. Her childhood in Manchester was a carousel of shifting addresses and unreliable promises, her single mother chasing better paychecks while leaving Sienna to learn resilience in silence. School plays became her first escape, the applause of strangers soothed the ache of invisibility. By the time she moved to London, Sienna was chasing auditions with a hunger that disguised her fear of being ordinary. She took small gigs, brand ambassador at product launches, hostess at luxury car showcases, extra in music videos, and learned quickly how to carry herself as if the spotlight already belonged to her. That false confidence drew attention and opened doors, but behind closed doors she would stare into the mirror too long, tracing lines that weren't there yet, asking herself if the image would be enough. Her greatest fear wasn't rejection, it was irrelevance. It was during a pitch meeting for a beverage sponsor that her path crossed Adrian's. She entered the room in a sapphire dress that photographed well under fluorescence, clutching a portfolio full of half-formed content strategies. Adrian, orchestrating the event setup, was in his element, directing crews, soothing the sponsor's nerves, fixing a broken light with his own hands. Their chemistry was immediate, but not purely romantic, it was opportunistic. Adrian admired her charisma, the way she could turn a hesitant maybe into a promising yes with a tilt of her chin. Sienna, meanwhile, admired his command of chaos, his ability to make shaky plans feel like certainties. Over coffee after the meeting, she listened as he sketched out his vision of building an empire of events, shows that would echo across cities. She smiled, masking her calculation. He has the stage, I have the spotlight. Together, they could amplify each other. But for Sienna, it was always a question of how much more she could take than give. As her influencer following grew, first in hundreds, then thousands, Sienna began to realize her talent wasn't in originality but in framing. She knew how to seize a moment and make it look curated, how to craft a caption that pulled envy from strangers, and how to present herself as both aspirational and relatable in the same breath. Yet the applause, the likes, the comments never quelled the gnawing thought that someone younger, fresher, smarter might be waiting just around the corner to steal her place. That fear hardened into ambition. Alone in her flat, she rehearsed monologues into the mirror. They'll never forget me. I'll make them look. Her vow was quiet but unshakable. She would one day be the headline, the main event, the woman no one could ignore. But ambition had a cost, and Sienna was prepared to pay it with other people's trust, even if it meant standing in Naomi's shadow without acknowledging the debt. Naomi and Adrian's early marriage was stitched together with tenderness and threadbare budgets. Their rented studio in Bermondsey was barely wider than the length of Adrian's bike propped against the wall, with a kitchenette that hissed whenever the kettle and toaster ran at the same time. Yet in that small space, mornings carried a kind of intimacy that money couldn't buy. Naomi would prepare porridge with fruit she carefully rationed from discount bins, while Adrian scribbled notes for event ideas on the backs of takeaway menus. They would sit on mismatched chairs, knees brushing, whispering encouragements, hers to slow down and plan, his to dream bigger and risk more. In those moments, it felt like partnership, the kind built not on extravagance but endurance. To anyone else, it was a life of limits, but to Naomi, those breakfasts were proof of shared purpose. What she couldn't know was that seeds of imbalance were already being sown in the spaces they didn't discuss. By day, Naomi fought to keep her tiny beauty shop alive, cutting costs by cleaning late into the night, ordering the cheapest supplies she could find, and offering loyalty discounts to keep her few customers returning. Her hands cracked from overuse of sanitizers, but she smiled through it, convinced that perseverance would eventually pay off. Meanwhile, Adrian bounced from one gig to another, sometimes returning home flushed with excitement after securing a minor festival contract, other times carrying the frustration of cancellations and unpaid invoices. Naomi wanted to be his steady anchor, listening and offering practical advice, but Adrian began to crave an audience that would marvel at his vision rather than question the logistics. He assured her every missed dinner was temporary, every cancellation just a stepping stone to something larger. But Naomi, lying awake alone, noticed the silences lengthening, the distance growing, as if the same walls that once made them close now pressed them apart. The fractures deepened slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Adrian thrived in crowds, and noise, and late-night strategy sessions with sponsors and promoters who fueled his adrenaline. Naomi, however, found solace in structure, lists, and the steady hum of her sterilizer machine at the shop. She began to feel invisible to him, her sacrifices unnoticed in the glare of his ambitions. She wanted to believe love could withstand missed anniversaries and forgotten calls, yet each neglect carved deeper into her resolve. Adrian still looked at her with affection at times, but his gaze often carried distraction, as though she were a comforting fixture rather than a partner he needed to build with. Both convinced themselves it was just a season, that love would carry them back to center. But beneath their whispered reassurances, something fragile had begun to crack, a truth neither wanted to admit. Love wasn't failing, but attention was, and without attention, even the strongest bond could wither quietly. The night of the rooftop launch shimmered with the kind of artificial glamour Adrian had always promised Naomi would one day surround them. High above Waterloo, fairy lights tangled with the London skyline, champagne flutes clinked in manicured hands, and sponsors preened as if they owned the city. Adrian darted through the crowd like a conductor, headset in place, ensuring sound systems hummed and guests felt indulged. Naomi had come quietly, carrying a small box of skincare samples she had fought to include in the influencer gift bags. To her, this was an opportunity, not just for sales but for visibility. But as she set the box near a velvet table, she caught whispers, followed by a burst of laughter that stung sharper than the evening chill. Hidden in a side corridor, she saw Adrian leaning close to Sienna, his hand brushing the back of her dress as he told a private joke that had no place in a marriage. The realization hit Naomi not as a dramatic explosion but as a clean, surgical cut, betrayal confirmed. She stood frozen, hands tight around her sample box, heartbeat pounding louder than the music spilling from the rooftop speakers. For months she had ignored the missed calls, the forgotten dinners, the late-night meetings that smelled faintly of perfume when Adrian finally stumbled home. She had rationalized, told herself he was building their future, told herself sacrifice was part of love. But in that single, unguarded moment, the illusion shattered. Sienna's laugh rang out, dazzling, rehearsed, victorious. Adrian's eyes glimmered with the kind of attention Naomi hadn't seen directed at her in months. She didn't cry, didn't storm, didn't make a scene. Instead, she turned, walked calmly through the glamorous crowd, and stepped into the lift. By the time she reached the ground floor, her decision had crystallized into something immovable. Their marriage wasn't wounded, it was already gone. The samples in her box felt suddenly heavier, not as dreams deferred but as burdens she no longer needed to share. The divorce, when it came, was swift, precise, and almost eerily quiet. Priya helped Naomi navigate the paperwork with a steady hand, ensuring Naomi kept her modest shop and no entanglements tied her to Adrian's growing empire. Naomi refused alimony, refused to fight for anything beyond what was hers already. She didn't want apologies, none could erase the truth she had seen. Adrian didn't beg, he signed, nodded once, and left the solicitor's office as though he were stepping into a new project rather than ending a marriage. For Naomi, the silence that followed was both devastating and liberating. She returned to her shop the very next morning, turned the key, and breathed in the familiar scent of eucalyptus oil. It was small, imperfect, and nearly failing, but it was hers. What she didn't yet know was that from this fracture, from this seeming collapse, the first sparks of her reinvention would be lit, reshaping not just her life but eventually the city that had once overlooked her. Naomi's first real step toward reinvention came not from some grand revelation but from exhaustion. Weeks after the divorce, she sat in her shop one evening, staring at shelves stocked with products that never moved, her hands raw from endless cleaning. The old sterilizer ticked in the background like a clock mocking her failures. Yet in the silence, a stubborn thought pressed forward: what if the problem wasn't me, but the way the entire system treated people like me? It wasn't enough to sell creams and lotions. Customers needed trust, science, and guidance, things bigger brands faked with marketing gloss but rarely delivered. So when Priya invited her to a community accelerator in Camden, Naomi went with cautious curiosity. The warehouse buzzed with young founders, people pitching ideas on recycled notebooks, laptops balanced on laps, ambition louder than resources. It was there she met Zoe Chen, a data-driven product thinker who believed technology could make diagnostics accessible, and Mateo Alvarez, a logistics mind who treated supply chains like puzzles he loved to solve. For the first time, Naomi felt she wasn't carrying the dream alone. Her notebook filled not with bills and rent worries, but sketches of possibilities. The accelerator became her proving ground, but the early experiments weren't triumphant, they were humbling. With Zoe's help, Naomi launched a pop-in skintech bar at a street market in Camden, offering quick diagnostics paired with personalized product recommendations. Mateo hauled equipment, taped extension cords to wet pavement, and scolded vendors who tried to edge into their stall space. Naomi herself stood behind a small table, speaking with as much patience as she could muster. But the drizzle that day thinned foot traffic, and the people who did stop often left without buying. Their one sale was to a tired office worker who admitted she just wanted to be polite. At night, Naomi felt the sting of failure like salt on a wound. Yet Priya's words echoed in her mind: every no is data. Every setback is still a step. Instead of folding, Naomi meticulously recorded every rejection, every puzzled expression, and every question they couldn't answer. She had failed at sales, but succeeded at listening, and that was worth more than pride. Dr. Oliver Reed entered the picture at the exact moment Naomi needed credibility. A dermatologist with a reputation for blunt honesty, he attended one of the accelerator's open nights and listened to Naomi's pitch with arms crossed, unimpressed by buzzwords. But when she explained her vision, safe, evidence-based skincare that didn't require navigating lies or jargon, his posture shifted. If you commit to real safety, no shortcuts, no miracle claims, then I'll back you, he said. His support wasn't financial but scientific, lending authority to her dream in a way no glossy ad campaign could. Naomi left that night not with profits but with partnerships, and in that shift lay the spark of reinvention. Her beauty shop was still small, her resources still limited, but she was no longer just a struggling shopkeeper. She was a founder with a team, a purpose, and the beginnings of a system that could challenge industries much larger than her own. What had begun as survival was now reshaping into vision, and though she didn't yet see the full road ahead, she felt the ground under her feet finally solidify. The breakthrough Naomi needed came in the form of a crisis. Mateo, who had become her right hand in logistics, discovered that their planned packaging supplier in Birmingham had abruptly pulled out due to rising costs and a larger competitor buying their entire inventory. For a business already hanging by a thread, this meant disaster. Orders could not be fulfilled, new customers would be lost, and the momentum they had fought so hard to spark would evaporate. Sitting in the dim light of her shop, Naomi listened as Mateo laid out their dwindling options. They could either delay orders and risk their reputation before it even formed, or they could attempt to source bottles and packaging abroad, where sustainability standards were stricter and options broader. There's a lead in Rotterdam, Mateo said, sliding a printed email across her desk. It wasn't a promise, just a chance, but Naomi seized it anyway. The very next morning, before dawn broke, she and Mateo boarded a ferry, not with the air of tourists but with the desperation of two people whose livelihood depended on what waited at the other shore. The Rotterdam docks were harsh, industrial, and far from welcoming. Naomi found herself in a stark warehouse office where the supplier, a shrewd Dutch businessman named Hendrik, explained flatly that their minimum order quantities were far beyond her budget. Other founders might have walked away or begged for leniency, but Naomi did neither. Instead, she pulled out her notebook, opened to pages filled with careful data, customer profiles, market gaps, sustainability statistics, and made her case. She promised smaller, guaranteed reorders, highlighted the growth trajectory they were building, and demonstrated why it was better to bet on a small but committed partner than a larger but unreliable chain of middlemen. Hendrik, unimpressed at first, leaned back with crossed arms, testing her resolve. But as Naomi spoke, unwavering, her conviction softened his resistance. After hours of tense discussion, he relented, offering a reduced MOQ with the condition that she prove her reliability within 3 months. Naomi signed with shaking hands, aware she had just gambled everything she owned and more on her ability to deliver. The ferry ride back to London was not triumphant in the traditional sense. Naomi and Matteo were bone-tired, damp from sea spray, and too drained to celebrate. Yet as the city skyline came back into view at dawn, the mood shifted. They had left with a crisis and returned with a lifeline. At the shop, Zoe greeted them with unexpected news. She had finalized the prototype for their digital diagnostic tool. It was rudimentary, running on a cheap tablet and cobbled together code, but it worked, an algorithm to assess skin type and recommend routines. Naomi, standing in her small shop with Rotterdam contracts in one hand and Zoe's prototype in the other, realized she was no longer bound by the identity of a struggling shop owner. She was now part of a venture that stretched across borders, disciplines, and possibilities. Exhaustion gave way to something stronger, resolve. Though success still seemed fragile, for the first time, Naomi believed her vision had a future bigger than the cramped walls of her shop. And it terrified her as much as it thrilled her. Sunday mornings in Brixton Market were always alive with noise, steel pans echoing from one end, the aroma of jerk chicken competing with the tang of fresh produce, voices rising and folding over each other like waves. Into this chaos, Naomi, Zoe, and Matteo set up a humble stall tucked between a vintage record seller and a fruit vendor. There was no glossy signage, no neon lights to lure attention, just a simple banner that read, "Skin Health, for everyone." What drew people wasn't spectacle but curiosity. Naomi offered free skin assessments using Zoe's diagnostic prototype, taking the time to listen to every complaint, dry patches, allergic flare-ups, breakouts no product seemed to cure. Instead of pushing sales, she explained causes, gave simple routines, and offered tiny trial samples they could afford. Lines formed not because people wanted a miracle but because, for once, someone was willing to hear them without judgment. By mid-morning, the stall became an unlikely hub, buzzing with chatter and laughter, and Naomi felt something stir inside her, validation that empathy was a currency more powerful than marketing. Among the crowd stood a woman with a notebook tucked discreetly under her arm, her sharp eyes watching everything, Tamsin Kerr, an investigative journalist who rarely wasted weekends on small markets. She had come to research a story on overpriced wellness brands but found herself drawn to the quiet professionalism Naomi radiated. Tamsin noted how Naomi didn't exaggerate claims, how she corrected Matteo when he tried to oversell, and how Zoe explained the tech without jargon. It was so unlike the polished scams she usually exposed. Tamsin scribbled one line in her notebook, "This isn't hustle. This is service." She left without revealing who she was, but the observation stayed with her, an ember of a bigger piece she might write. Naomi didn't notice her leave. She was too busy tending to a nervous teenager battling acne scars, assuring him that what he saw as ruin was treatable, not permanent. As the day ended, Naomi counted not profits but interactions. They had made modest sales, true, but what mattered was that the stall had built trust, a seed that could grow into loyalty. When Nora, Naomi's younger sister, arrived later that evening with blistered feet from her shift as a server, she watched the tired pride on Naomi's face and offered her services. "I can help on weekends," Nora said, her dry humor barely concealing admiration. It was the first time Naomi felt her dream touch family in a tangible way. That night, as they packed up under fading light, Naomi realized the shop she once thought of as a cage had transformed into a launch pad. Brixton Market wasn't a glamorous beginning, but it was proof that her idea wasn't just theory anymore, it was community. And if community embraced her, then the empire she once thought impossible might just be within reach. What she didn't know was that Tamsin's notebook would soon become the first ripple of recognition that would shift her path forever. While Naomi was rediscovering her footing in Brixton, Adrian Mercer was chasing momentum of a different kind. His company, Orbit Live, had gone from a few scrappy warehouse shows to mid-tier contracts that promised prestige but came with brutal demands. For months, he poured his energy into producing an outdoor cultural festival in Canary Wharf, complete with live bands, floating lanterns, and a waterfront fireworks display. On opening night, the crowd swelled beyond expectations, but chaos struck when an overzealous intern mishandled a sprinkler system. Water burst across a VIP lounge, short-circuiting equipment and soaking invited sponsors. Adrian, headset buzzing with conflicting voices, sprinted through the venue to coordinate damage control. He calmed guests, rearranged seating, and improvised entertainment while crews scrambled to salvage gear. By dawn, he had prevented total collapse, but the incident left Orbit Live with angry clients, spiraling costs, and a reputation scarred. Adrian smiled for the press, projecting control, but inside he knew he was walking a financial tightrope where one more misstep could end him. Sienna, ever the opportunist, refused to let failure define their trajectory. She pressed Adrian to stop wasting time on mid-level gigs that carried more risk than reward and instead aimed for a single spectacle, a defining event that would eclipse every past mistake. "One show can change everything," she said, her manicured fingers tracing future headlines on her phone screen. She had connections at Halcyon Media, a broadcasting giant with global reach, and she convinced Adrian that if they staged something extraordinary, Halcyon would back it. Adrian's instincts warred between fear and ambition, but his hunger for legacy tipped the scales. He began crafting a proposal so audacious that even his closest allies doubted it. The plan, a global live event at the O2 Arena, streamed across continents, with Sienna as the dazzling centerpiece. To him, it was redemption. To Sienna, it was coronation. Neither acknowledged how fragile their foundation had become. To pull it off, Adrian needed more than dreams, he needed the city's blessing. That meant facing Benedict Shaw, a sharp-eyed counselor known for shutting down flashy productions that endangered public resources. Shaw was skeptical from the start, questioning budgets, permits, and local benefits. Adrian, however, played his strongest card, jobs. He promised Orbit Live would hire locally, from stagehands to caterers, creating real economic ripple effects. The counselor leaned back, skeptical yet intrigued, and demanded detailed projections. Adrian delivered, spending sleepless nights refining numbers until his proposal glistened with feasibility. Against odds, Shaw relented, granting permits with conditions attached. Walking out of City Hall, Adrian felt the thrill of victory but also the weight of the gamble. The stakes were no longer personal, they were public, colossal, and irreversible. He told himself this was the moment he had been building toward since the days of temp jobs and broken equipment. Yet in his heart, he knew, if this show failed, there would be no coming back. And still, he smiled, because Adrian had always believed he was born for the brink. While Adrian courted headlines, Naomi was quietly building something far less theatrical but far more enduring. With Zoe's tech expertise, she launched a direct-to-consumer website that felt nothing like the overwhelming digital storefronts drowning in jargon. The interface was clean, intuitive, and centered on transparency, ingredient lists laid bare, recommendations explained in plain language, and Oliver Reed himself appearing in short video clips to debunk common skincare myths. Customers weren't being sold dreams, they were being offered clarity. Naomi spent late nights answering emails personally, ensuring no question went ignored. For every order shipped, she included handwritten notes of thanks, knowing small touches were what turned buyers into believers. Orders began as a trickle, but within weeks, they grew steadily, fueled by word of mouth. For the first time since the divorce, Naomi's bank account reflected possibility rather than survival. She didn't smile often, but when she did, it was usually at the sight of her small team, Zoe, Mateo, and Nora, working side by side like they had been destined to find each other. Then came the ripple effect of attention. Tamsin Kerr, the investigative journalist who had quietly observed Naomi at Brixton, released a thoughtful feature in a mid-tier publication. It wasn't sensational, it was evidence-based praise that highlighted Naomi's insistence on safety, her openness about setbacks, and her ability to put community above profit. The piece went viral not because it was flashy but because readers recognized authenticity. Suddenly, Naomi was receiving messages from mothers, teenagers, and professionals across the UK thanking her for honesty in an industry built on exaggeration. Sales doubled almost overnight, and the once silent shop on Peckham's High Street became a bustling hub, with customers traveling from neighborhoods Naomi had never stepped foot in before. She didn't chase this recognition, but she accepted it with quiet dignity, grateful yet wary of the spotlight she once thought belonged only to people like Sienna. The growing momentum caught the eye of Graham Whitaker, a silver-haired investor known less for chasing trends and more for betting on substance. He invited Naomi to tea at his Kensington townhouse, where the walls were lined not with art but with shelves of books on business history and philanthropy. Over steaming cups of Earl Grey, he asked her meticulous questions, not about profit margins but about values, scalability, and how she planned to protect her integrity once larger sums of money were at stake. Naomi answered with the same calm resolve that had carried her through sleepless nights at the shop. Graham smiled, impressed but not easily swayed, and left without offering a deal. Yet his parting words lingered: the market doesn't need another empire built on illusion. It needs proof that decency can compete with spectacle. If you can prove that, I'll come back. Naomi walked away not with capital but with something rarer, validation from a man who saw the long game. And she knew then that her path, though quiet, was beginning to carry its own undeniable weight. The O2 Arena was a cavern of ambition in its rawest form. Even in rehearsal, the space pulsed with energy, rigging teams suspended from steel beams, sound checks booming across the dome, lighting crews testing strobes until the floor shimmered. In the center of it all was Sienna Rowe, headset perched like a crown, pacing across the stage with the sharp authority of someone who believed this was her moment. Every cue mark had to be perfect, every camera angle rehearsed until it became second nature. She barked corrections at technicians, demanded reshoots of rehearsal footage, and even corrected the cadence of her own lines, unwilling to let any flaw slip through. To her, this wasn't preparation, it was coronation. This was the event where the city, the country, perhaps the world, would finally see her not just as an influencer or host, but as the star she had always believed she was destined to be. The rehearsal floor might have been empty, but in her mind, she was already performing to millions. Adrian, meanwhile, was buried in logistics. To him, rehearsals were less about grandeur and more about survival. His clipboard overflowed with contracts, invoices, and production schedules that could unravel if a single supplier faltered. He argued with catering about safety protocols, double-checked rigging licenses, and pressed accountants for budget confirmations while Sienna preened before mirrors. Their partnership seemed united on the surface, but their priorities had diverged sharply. Adrian was consumed by the machinery of keeping the show alive, while Sienna was obsessed with polishing the surface until it shone brighter than any truth behind it. Yet even he couldn't deny her magnetism, the way stagehands paused as she moved, the way sponsors leaned forward when she rehearsed introductions. For Adrian, it was a dangerous dance. Her allure brought in money and attention, but her arrogance could burn bridges faster than he could build them. Offstage, cracks were already forming. Back in green rooms lined with half-unpacked costumes, Sienna practiced her speeches in front of assistants who were too intimidated to correct her mistakes. She framed narratives in her head: this is my show, my victory, my legacy. What she ignored was the brittle edge creeping into her tone when she rehearsed too long, or the moment her hand trembled slightly when the lights dimmed. She masked her growing anxiety with layers of performance, insisting to Adrian that every detail must orbit her presence. This is the moment people will remember me forever, she whispered one evening, her reflection staring back with unblinking hunger. Adrian nodded, distracted by an urgent text about permits, missing entirely the fragility hidden beneath her confidence. Sienna didn't notice either. She was too caught up in the glittering vision of herself, too sure that nothing could disrupt her narrative. But behind the walls of the arena, decisions were being made that would eventually prove her assumption wrong in ways she could never imagine. The knock on Naomi's office door in Peckham came late in the evening, long after the shop had closed and the last courier had gone. Graham Whitaker stepped in with the unhurried grace of a man who had never once been rushed by circumstance. He placed a leather folder on the counter and began without pleasantries. "There's an opening, but it isn't for the faint-hearted." Inside the folder was a proposal outlining a consortium of investors, quiet, strategic players, interested in acquiring naming rights and a controlling stake in Orbit Live's upcoming O2 spectacle. At first glance, Naomi nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. Why would she, the woman Adrian had left behind, want anything to do with his empire now? But as Graham spoke, the offer sharpened into clarity. This wasn't about revenge, it was about leverage. With the right terms, she could ensure fair treatment of crews, protection for contractors, and late payment penalties that safeguarded those too often crushed under flashy events. Naomi listened in silence, her pulse quickening, until she asked the only question that mattered: "Would I have control?" Graham nodded. "Only if you demand it." Priya, ever the strategist, insisted they tread carefully. Together with Naomi, she dissected every clause, every projection, every silent partner who might want to manipulate outcomes. The stakes weren't just financial, they were reputational. If Naomi aligned herself with Orbit Live, she risked being dismissed as a bitter ex-wife attempting sabotage. But Priya reframed it with sharp precision: "You're not attaching yourself to Adrian's show. You're rewriting its backbone. And that is different." Zoe and Matteo rallied too, understanding that this opportunity could catapult them from small market experiments into industry players overnight. Dr. Oliver Reed, cautious as always, only gave his blessing once Naomi assured him safety and transparency would remain her conditions of entry. Slowly, the idea shifted from impossible to inevitable. What had begun as a laughable suggestion turned into a blueprint of transformation, not just for Naomi, but for every small operator who had ever been trampled by the weight of a spectacle they helped build but never profited from. The final piece lay with Benedict Shaw, the city councilor already circling Adrian's permits like a hawk. When Naomi and Priya arrived at his office, they expected hostility, but instead they found curiosity. Benedict leaned back, arms folded, listening as Naomi laid out her terms: transparent finances, welfare guarantees for contractors, and a system of checks that no one could bypass, not even Orbit Live's leadership. His eyebrow arched when she revealed her identity as Adrian's ex-wife, yet he didn't dismiss her. "Instead," he said, "if what you're proposing works, it protects my city. That matters more than your history." Hours later, he signed off on a revised city agreement, one that locked in protections Adrian would have to honor whether he liked it or not. When Naomi left the building, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt a strange, steady calm. For the first time, her reinvention wasn't just about her shop, her survival, or even her vision. It was about reshaping an industry that had long thrived on exploitation. What she didn't yet realize was how dramatically her presence would upend the stage Sienna believed belonged solely to her. The O2 Arena gleamed like a jewel against the London night, its white dome glowing under a sky streaked with searchlights and drones capturing every angle for the millions watching across the globe. The red carpet was a frenzy of flashbulbs, celebrities draped in glittering gowns, and sponsors smiling wider than their wallets. At the center of it all was Sienna Rowe, stepping onto the crimson walkway in a gown of golden sequins that caught every camera's gaze. She waved, posed, and basked in the thunderous applause, convinced this was the moment her life had been leading toward. She whispered to herself, "I am the main event," as if repeating it could make it truth. Inside, the show unfolded with breathtaking choreography, laser lights, live performances, and screens broadcasting Sienna's poised commentary. To the audience, she was the star, radiant and untouchable. But beneath the layers of spectacle, an undercurrent of anticipation hummed, one that even Sienna's instincts could not interpret. Something was about to shift. Midway through the show, as cameras panned across the audience between acts, the lens lingered on a private balcony. There, standing with effortless composure in a minimalist silver gown, was Naomi Clark. She hadn't entered through the front like the stars, hadn't sought the frenzy of flashbulbs. Instead, she appeared as if she belonged to a different world altogether, calm, dignified, and commanding without a word. Whispers rippled through the audience, swelling into murmurs that reached the stage. Social media exploded within seconds. Who is she? Why does she look so powerful? That's Adrienne Mercer's ex-wife. Tamsin Kerr, seated near the press pit, was the first to recognize her fully and tweeted, "The future of this show just walked in, and it's not who you think." Sienna, catching the audience's shift of focus, faltered for a fraction of a second, her perfect smile tightening as though she had just glimpsed her greatest nightmare. Then came the revelation that no one, least of all Sienna, had prepared for. As the anchor transitioned to a segment on the show's future, the screens lit up with breaking text: Strategic Leadership Update, Halcyon Consortium appoints Naomi Clark as lead. The crowd gasped audibly, the collective intake of breath echoing louder than any applause. In that single announcement, the balance shifted. Naomi wasn't just an ex-wife in the crowd, she was the new power behind the curtain, the woman who had reshaped the foundation of the very event Sienna thought belonged to her. Cameras cut to Adrian in the control booth, his expression unreadable as he caught Naomi's gaze. There was no begging, no bitterness, only a quiet nod of acknowledgement, as if he understood that this was the culmination of choices both of them had made. On stage, Sienna's glittering facade cracked, her smile stiffening as whispers of wow rolled through the arena. In that moment, the main event wasn't the show, the spectacle, or even Sienna. It was Naomi, reinvented, unshakable, and impossible to ignore. The morning after Halcyon Live was chaos, not just in the O2 cleanup crew still dismantling scaffolding, but across every digital platform where the event had trended overnight. Hashtag split audiences in two, hashtag Sienna the Star versus hashtag Naomi the Future. Some fans clung to Sienna's dazzling stage presence, praising her glamour and poise, while others marveled at Naomi's quiet but commanding reveal that shifted the conversation entirely. The press scrambled to keep up. Tabloids ran side-by-side spreads of the two women, headlines like Queen of Glam versus Queen of Grace competing for space. Naomi, however, refused to feed the frenzy. When a swarm of reporters appeared outside her Peckham shop, she calmly stated, "This isn't about me. It's about ensuring fairness behind the scenes." Then she shut the door, leaving them with nothing but a soundbite. Inside, she redirected her team's focus toward stabilizing orders and communicating with suppliers. Her deflection wasn't weakness, it was strategy. By denying scandal, she forced the narrative toward credibility, something her competitors couldn't easily undermine. Priya, ever the tactician, countered the inevitable smear campaigns with precision. When a gossip outlet published a sloppy rumor that Naomi had schemed her way into leadership out of spite for Adrian, Priya crafted a single statement that dismantled it without theatrics. She highlighted Naomi's track record, the consortium's approval, and, most importantly, the new contractual protections for freelancers and vendors that had already gone into effect. The statement didn't just silence critics, it reframed Naomi as someone who had elevated industry standards overnight. Meanwhile, backstage crews from the O2 quietly received their payments 2 weeks early, a shock in an industry where delayed pay was the norm. Word spread quickly, and soon whispers about Naomi weren't about her past marriage but about her integrity. "She paid us faster than anyone ever has," one stagehand tweeted, sparking a wave of respect from the very workers who often went unheard. Naomi's power wasn't just in boardrooms or headlines, it was in loyalty earned at the ground level. Sienna, however, faced a different rhythm. She had left the O2 expecting to ride a tide of adoration, but instead, she found herself under siege. A careless snap from the green room, her complaining about crew incompetence while holding a flute of champagne, surfaced online and went viral within hours. The backlash was immediate and ruthless. Followers who once adored her accused her of arrogance, influencers who had partnered with her pulled away, and brands quietly suspended deals. The same spotlight she had craved now burned mercilessly. Adrian tried to focus on stabilizing Orbit Live, but the shadows of Naomi's new influence and Sienna's unraveling reputation made the air heavier with each passing day. The world was no longer orbiting Sienna's glow, it was recalibrating around Naomi's gravity. And though Naomi never gloated, never fed the narrative with bitterness, she knew the tide had turned. Her reinvention wasn't just recognized, it was being cemented in the very industry that once left her invisible. In the aftermath of Halcyon Live, Priya Desai found herself busier than she had been in years. Not only was she managing Naomi's expanding contracts, but she also spearheaded a separate legal battle that had been brewing quietly in the city, a case to secure protection for freelancers who were too often exploited by event companies. For months she had collected testimonies from stagehands, caterers, and technicians who were underpaid or left unpaid entirely. Now, with Naomi's reforms as precedent, Priya seized the momentum. Standing in a courtroom lined with press and anxious workers, she argued with surgical precision that creative industries had thrived on unpaid labor for too long. The case concluded with a landmark clause, mandatory freelancer protection embedded into city policy. That night, her rowing club gathered at their boathouse, where Priya, usually calm and understated, allowed herself a rare grin as teammates clapped her on the back. The win wasn't glamorous, but it was historic, and it cemented her as more than Naomi's barrister. She was now an advocate in her own right, reshaping a system that had silenced too many voices. Meanwhile, Mateo Alvarez was facing challenges of his own. As Naomi's business swelled, so did the pressure on logistics. A major shipment bound for London stalled when a truck broke down on the French side of the Channel Tunnel, threatening to derail deliveries promised to new partners. For hours, chaos buzzed as suppliers demanded answers and retailers grew restless. Mateo, once just a quiet operator behind spreadsheets, found himself commanding a small crisis team. He rerouted drivers, negotiated emergency storage, and even arranged for part of the shipment to be flown into London at minimal cost, an impossible balance of speed and frugality. The near disaster revealed his steel. Warehouse crews, initially skeptical of his calm demeanor, began referring to him as the anchor. When the shipment finally arrived, only half a day late, Naomi hugged him, a gesture that startled them both with its warmth. For Mateo, the crisis wasn't just a professional victory, it was the moment he realized he was no longer just helping Naomi's dream, he was investing his own pride in its survival. Tamsin Kerr, on the other hand, faced temptations she hadn't anticipated. Her editor pressed her to chase the scandalous angle, Naomi versus Sienna, ex-wife versus mistress, a narrative that guaranteed clicks. But Tamsin resisted, refusing to reduce Naomi's journey to cheap rivalry. Instead, she published a long-form feature tracing the deeper truths, how grassroots businesses could thrive without deception, how women entrepreneurs faced double scrutiny, and how industry reform was often sparked not by billion-dollar giants but by those who had once been dismissed. The article gained traction not for its gossip, but for its integrity, and it earned her both criticism and admiration within her newsroom. Alone in her flat later that night, she set up a chessboard, as was her ritual after publishing something risky. As she moved pawns and knights across the board, she thought of Naomi, Priya, and Mateo, not as pawns at all, but as players shifting the entire game. For Tamsin, choosing honesty over spectacle became her own reinvention, one that mirrored Naomi's in a quieter, but no less powerful, way. Naomi had not seen her childhood coastline in years, but when she finally stood on the promenade with Nora beside her, the salt-laced wind carried her back instantly. The sea stretched gray and restless, just as it had when she was a child who used to trace words in the sand, only to watch the waves erase them. Now, as an adult who had carved her place in the world, the erasures no longer frightened her, they reminded her of resilience. Nora, shivering in her waitress's jacket, teased Naomi about dragging her so far out of London just to smell fish and salt, but her sarcasm softened when she saw her sister's expression. "You've changed," Nora said quietly, "but not in the way I thought you would. You didn't become cold. You became bigger." Naomi laughed, shaking her head, but the truth resonated. They sat on a bench with hot chips wrapped in paper, finally voicing the unspoken envies and wounds of their past. Nora admitted she had resented Naomi for always seeming responsible, while Naomi confessed she had envied Nora's ease with humor and people. By the end of the meal, the silence between them had shifted from brittle to warm. Later that evening, Naomi walked Nora to their parents' small house, a familiar brick home still lined with roses their mother fussed over every spring. Elaine greeted them with misty eyes, hugging her daughters as though time itself had conspired to keep them apart too long. Robert, her father, was slower to soften, his stubborn streak still intact, but even he could not hide the pride etched into his withered face as Naomi shared what she had built. For years he had worried she would collapse under the weight of her choices, yet now he listened as she explained contracts, logistics, and reforms with a confidence that left him stunned. "You're not just surviving anymore," he murmured, almost to himself. Naomi felt her throat tighten. This was the validation she had chased silently since leaving home, not applause from the public, but acknowledgement from her father, whose approval was always measured and hard-won. That night, over tea and old family stories, she felt the roots she had once left behind quietly entwining with her present. The next morning, Naomi woke early and laced her running shoes, slipping out before dawn painted the horizon. The promenade was empty save for gulls wheeling overhead and the rhythmic crash of waves. She ran until her lungs burned, until each step aligned with a new mantra, not revenge, renewal. She repeated it like prayer, allowing the weight of her past, her broken marriage, her struggling shop, the betrayals, to dissolve into the salt air. Renewal meant building without bitterness, pushing forward without tethering herself to those who had tried to diminish her. As the sun broke through clouds, gilding the water in copper light, Naomi slowed and finally stopped, hands braced on her knees. She stared out at the endless horizon, not with fear but with certainty. The woman who had once been overlooked was now unshakable, grounded, and still rising. The waves had erased her words before, but this time, she knew, nothing could erase her. The future wasn't waiting to be begged for, it was hers to define. Adrian Mercer sat in his office surrounded by screens streaming post-show analytics, each graph a reminder of the empire he had built but no longer fully controlled. The consortium's involvement had guaranteed survival, but survival had come at the cost of sovereignty. Contracts now carried penalties he couldn't bypass, and payment structures favored crews and vendors first, leaving Orbit live with slimmer margins. For a man who once thrived on bending chaos to his will, it felt like shackles. Yet Adrian wasn't bitter, at least, not entirely. He recognized Naomi's fingerprints on the new order, the fairness baked into agreements, the absence of exploitation he had once overlooked. For the first time in years, he considered stepping away from the spotlight he had chased since his youth. Sitting in the dim glow of his monitors, he whispered, "Maybe this is enough," as though saying it aloud might convince him. He wasn't admitting defeat but accepting a truth he'd long ignored. Sometimes endurance meant knowing when to yield. Sienna's descent was harder and far less graceful. After the backlash from her green room photo, she tried desperately to claw back relevance, posting curated apologies, staging charity appearances, even attempting to spin herself as a misunderstood victim. But the public wasn't convinced. Brands that once courted her now ghosted her emails, and sponsorships dissolved without explanation. Her agent, once an eager advocate, stopped returning calls. At her lowest, Sienna met with a career coach who cut through her defenses with ruthless honesty. "You're not listening to people. You're only listening to your own echo," the coach told her. In anger, Sienna volunteered at a media literacy program for teens just to prove her critics wrong. But in the quiet of those classrooms, hearing young voices talk about insecurity, pressure, and manipulation, she felt something crack inside. For the first time, she wasn't performing. She was listening. And the silence that followed was terrifying, because it revealed a woman who had mistaken applause for identity. Meanwhile, Vivian Mercer, Adrian's estranged mother, watched the chaos unfold from her modest flat with a bittersweet pride. She had long known her son would chase fire until it burned him, but she hadn't expected him to emerge with humility. Seeing Naomi's rise and Adrian's quiet acceptance stirred memories of the boy she once guided through hotel lobbies, teaching him to greet guests with sincerity. With trembling hands, she wrote him a short letter on cream stationery, her words deliberate and unembellished, proud of a quiet exit. "Call when you can." For Vivian, this wasn't about reconciliation but acknowledgement, a gesture that reminded Adrian he was more than his failures, more than his ambition. The choices made by Naomi, Adrian, and Sienna each carried consequences that rippled beyond their control. But while Sienna wrestled with fading relevance, and Adrian with retreat, Naomi's name began to echo in boardrooms, markets, and headlines, not as an ex-wife, not as a survivor, but as a leader reshaping the rules of the game. The consequences of betrayal had birthed something neither Adrian nor Sienna had ever anticipated, a future Naomi commanded with unshakable grace. Naomi's vision for transformation didn't end with contracts or market recognition, it expanded into something communal, something that reached beyond her own enterprise. She called it the Commons, a shared laboratory and storefront designed for microfounders, freelancers, and small skincare creators who lacked resources to test and scale their products safely. The building itself, a repurposed textile warehouse in Southwark, was modest on the outside but humming with innovation inside. Stainless steel benches lined with glass jars, testing kits supplied at cost, and consultation rooms where dermatologists like Dr. Oliver Reed volunteered time created an atmosphere unlike anything the industry had seen. To Naomi, this was not charity, it was infrastructure. Every fledgling founder who walked through her doors represented the girl she once was, trapped in a failing shop with no guidance. By building the Commons, she was rewriting that narrative for others. "This is where impossible dreams learn to walk," she told Zoe one evening as they surveyed the finished space. And for once, Naomi allowed herself to believe that her reinvention was no longer personal, it was systemic. When Councillor Benedict Shaw visited for the official preview, his sharp skepticism softened. He was accustomed to flashy pitches from billion-pound conglomerates that promised community impact but delivered little. Yet here, he saw actual job numbers, training sessions in progress, and young founders handling real equipment with supervision. Naomi walked him through the transparent safety logs, the fair use agreements Priya had crafted, and the pipeline Matteo had designed to keep supply chains ethical and sustainable. Benedict, notoriously difficult to impress, lingered longer than expected, even staying to ask Oliver about lab protocols. By the time he left, he had quietly greenlit a grant to support additional equipment, citing measurable impact in his notes. The moment was small, almost bureaucratic, but Naomi recognized its power. The city itself was acknowledging her model, validating her belief that fairness and ambition could coexist. As Benedict shook her hand before departing, he muttered, "You've done what most companies never attempt, you've made the margins human." Naomi tucked those words into memory, knowing they would drive her forward on hard days. The launch event weeks later wasn't glamorous, but it was deeply moving. A grandmother who had been Naomi's third customer back in the struggling shop cut the ribbon, her hands trembling but proud. Founders showcased early prototypes, oils, balms, and serums, not as miracle cures but as products born from transparency and care. Zoe unveiled an upgraded diagnostic tool, capable of being installed in community clinics across London, ensuring that skin health wasn't confined to wealthier postcodes. Matteo, usually reserved, delivered a brief speech about logistics, drawing laughter when he compared shipping delays to the world's most relentless puzzle. And in the back row, Graham Whitaker observed quietly, smiling as though the experiment he had once doubted had now exceeded even his high standards. Tamsin, notebook in hand, captured the event not as spectacle but as proof that resilience could reshape entire industries. As applause echoed through the warehouse, Naomi didn't stand on stage to claim credit, she remained in the wings, watching others shine. In that moment, she realized her journey had transcended personal redemption. She had built not just a company, but a commons, a space where reinvention belonged to everyone brave enough to try. The official opening day of the Commons was unlike any ribbon-cutting London had seen. There were no celebrity endorsements, no fireworks, no influencers posing for cameras. Instead, the building filled with people who had never been invited to the front rows of the industry before, market vendors, struggling students, part-time workers with ideas scribbled in notebooks. At the entrance, a grandmother Naomi recognized instantly, the same woman who had been her third customer at her little shop, stood proudly with oversized scissors. She snipped the ribbon as applause rang out, her smile luminous. The symbolism was undeniable. A dream once nearly strangled by obscurity now had its doors wide open, and the very people who had once been customers were now partners in creation. Naomi clapped along from the side, preferring not to be the center of attention. She had no need for spotlight anymore. Her satisfaction came from watching others step into a world she had helped clear of obstacles. Tamsin's article about the opening struck a chord across the country. Rather than focusing on Naomi's history with Adrian or Sienna, the feature centered on testimonies from those already using the commons. A young founder spoke about finally having access to affordable lab space after being rejected by big cosmetic houses. A single mother explained how Zoe's diagnostic tool gave her daughter confidence after years of skin issues. These weren't glossy brand pitches, they were human stories, raw and moving, and readers responded with overwhelming empathy. Donations flowed in, small investors pledged support, and community groups began requesting branches in other boroughs. Naomi read the article in silence, her eyes wet not with pride but with relief. For once, her name wasn't the story, the people she had built for were. That shift, quiet yet monumental, was the truest sign that her reinvention was complete. As the crowd dispersed and her team celebrated, Naomi slipped away for her ritual run along the Thames. The evening light shimmered across the water, the same river she had once used to quiet her fears after long, lonely shop days. Her phone buzzed with messages, congratulations from Graham, updates from Priya, proud emojis from Nora, but she let it rest in her pocket. She didn't need applause, not anymore. Each stride carried her forward, her breath steady, her heart calm. There was no remarrying arc waiting for her, no ex-husband crawling back with regret. Adrian had accepted his path, Sienna was learning hers, and Naomi had forged her own with steel and grace. Renewal had replaced revenge, and community had replaced solitude. As the city lights flickered to life around her, she whispered her mantra one final time, not revenge, renewal. And with that, she smiled, not at the past she had overcome, but at the endless horizon she was now free to define. The end.